Welcome to First Answers. This is episode 3 in the series, A Parent's Guide to Gender Identity. Researchers have identified 4 experience domains that make up an individual's identity and shape how it develops. In each of these 4 areas, there are things you can do as a parent that can ensure that your children are healthy and successful. When you learn these methods, you can feel more confident as a parent. Visit firstanswers.com to find more about the podcast and tons of resources for families.
I am presenting these episodes on gender identity because I believe in my clinical work and my experience as a college teacher that conditions in our society has changed so dramatically in the last 15 years that unless we make some adjustment inside our families, we're going to be unprepared for the changes that happen socially that impact our children. One of these, of course, has to do with the questions of gender. What makes a successful female and male, and how you identify as such, is something that is currently being blurred a great deal by social media, other types of programs, social conditions. You only have to read the news or listen to it in order to see what is happening, because children are coming home at a very young age saying, am I this, am I that? Is something else going on? And parents who are like I would be, since I'm of a different generation, would be wondering, where is this coming from? And why is it happening? And then you find out the very, very discouraging idea that when children are experimenting with these ideas, a lot of school personnel feel obligated to keep that secret from the parents and encourage children to explore the nature of their gender in an environment that does not include their family. This is so astounding to me and jaw-dropping that I have a hard time knowing exactly how to respond, except that I've had to learn how, because in my clinical practice, I have met more of those individuals who have serious questions about their gender when there's no need to. And then I've seen individuals who have started to identify as something other than male and female and have run into certain kinds of problems and difficulties that they would not have had to experience had the circumstances been different. Now, I'd like to repeat something that I mentioned in the first 2 podcast episodes. And that is that the number of individuals who claim to have identity problems have doubled just in the last decade. Now, we could attribute some of that to the fact that it's difficult to come out or to identify yourself in public. And so now that the environment's a little more receptive, then perhaps more individuals feel more comfortable doing that. But that couldn't possibly explain the tremendous growth that has gone on. I'd like to propose to you that another explanation for some of the growth is that parents have been rearing their children without regard to gender, and that other forces are at work that teach them ideas that are contrary to what parents want them to know. And so, and behold, they announce they start to experiment mentally, then they experiment emotionally in relation to other people, and they form conclusions based on the fact that they've heard about it from other sources and they think it might apply to them. Now, in this podcast, my purpose is to identify some sources of identity formation and begin the description of what you as parents can do to promote the successful identity formation of your children. I want to begin with this idea. In order to contribute to the positive growth of a child's identity, you'll need to learn when to be involved and when not to be. This is because agency, or freedom to choose, is an essential part of identity formation. As it turns out, you can't force somebody to be a male when they don't feel like it, but you can, through a judicious use of freedom of choice, help them come to understand more about themselves and benefit from the right kind of influence. Too much involvement of the wrong kind can restrict a child's freedom and growth and actually create problems that are as bad as gender problems. I'd also like to point out that helping your children grow healthy personality requires that you assess yourself in terms of how you display who you think you are. as a male or a female. What you believe to be true about yourself and a positive view of what you think others think about you makes a big difference in terms of how you present yourself to your children. Now, there are many who currently believe that 21st century children face some challenges that children of a previous generation have not. I'm one of those. Today, there are political, educational, and social challenges to the family generally and to other things specifically, gender being one of those, as the preeminent place to nurture children. That is, many people are saying, well, we don't need families. It's like we can just say, let's just give birth to children, send them all as individuals to a little play school, and they'll turn out to be really successful people. Not true. It's just not true. For example, mental health professionals are sadly reporting increasing numbers of identity-linked mental, emotional, and social behavior problems showing up in mental hospitals and professional offices. Now, some attribute these events to the tsunami of social media and children's excessive use of it. I'm one of those. Some suggest the real problem in the erosion of quality education in our country. I'm one of those. Others see the problem as a decline or family as a priority. That's true for some families, but not others. We still have many wonderful, high-quality families. These and other factors may be involved. But an additional reason is that many parents caught off guard with the challenges to children identities simply don't know the sources of identity, and therefore they do not know what to do to move quickly and provide what 21st century children need. And the whole issue may seem so complex that parents feel overwhelmed. But for many parents, the time is right now when they need to have answers. So I propose that you listen to this podcast and add a little teeny bit of sense of urgency. We often have a habit of not aggressively searching for something until there is a non-ignorable problem, which potentially affect large numbers of people, some of whom are in our families and our neighborhoods, and then we say, yeah, we need to go to work on this one. According to many child experts, we are rapidly approaching that state of affairs where our children's gender identities are concerned, and their psychosocial identities for that matter. For example, more than one mother has said their children as young as 12 and 13 are talking with friends and coming home from school, making signs they want to talk about something difficult, and when the parents learn what it is, their children are involved in a same-sex group of girls and watching lesbian movies on the internet. One mother was surprised when her daughter asked if she was binary. So the girl said, "Mom, are you binary?" She didn't know what this meant at first, but found out that it refers to the ones and O's used in computer coding. She was told that this was a reference to gender nowadays, and her daughter was asking if she was one of two genders or if she was one of several other possibilities that she'd heard about at school. Now think about that. She had heard about this at school or with her friends or from the internet. She wanted to know what she should do with her daughter, this woman did, who might be identifying as something other than a female whose sexual orientation is toward males. Now, rather than wait for this issue to come up, consider the value of studying now that there are some types of identity that are more healthy than others, and then review what has contributed to complete, stable identities and what may be missing or mistaken when a child's identity is not healthy. This should make it more simple to understand and give you confidence you can do something good for your children. So here's the deal. We're trying to search for a clear definition of gender identity first so that you can say, all right, I've got a good idea about what it is. I need to know some things about how it happens and why it happens, and then I can do more about doing things that will contribute to my children's positive gender identity instead of assuming that it just happens automatically and the kids are growing up one day and say, wow, I'm an adequate, complete male and or female. So, in recent years, in my clinical work, I've been able to understand different ways to look at children's identity formation, and I believe, based on my experience, that there's a lot of confusion and disagreement about what affects gender growth, and perhaps more importantly, what constitutes a healthy gender identity. Now, in the first two episodes, I described Erik Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development. This is the earliest form of identity formation, to illustrate to you that identity is developmental. Some people believe it occurs in stages. I think that might be true in some situations, but not in others. I think probably more likely there are levels of experience that children go through when they are young, and then when they're in mid-childhood and when adolescence, or something like this. Now, learning what a healthy identity is and what we need is partly due to the fact that individual gender identity better matches cultural expectations, so we should focus on that. Now, one of the problems in preparing these episodes was that I wanted to be very respectful, because I am respectful of individuals who have gender-related problems. It's really a huge issue. Some people are working very hard to be happy and satisfied with themselves, and some are troubled. And I've spent quite a bit of time with people who are troubled. So again, I repeat that it is important for you to be certain about what healthy identity, gender identity means. Now, I wondered what would be the case if I focused on one type of identity and not all the others. That is complex enough because identity is often not stable. What this means is that on the way to growing up, the kids will learn something and then something else, and it'll raise a question that they see in themselves, and they'll think, well, I'm a this or I'm a that, and so on. Now, people change, and besides, identity takes a while to complete, and at any point in time, some are not finished or complete. Yet other forms of identity clearly differ markedly from a traditional heterosexual identity. And so what do we do about that? What do we do when we see some things that don't appear to be consistent or so on? Get all excited? I have, over my professional life, received many telephone calls from young mothers who will say something like, my little 2-year-old or 3-year-old likes to undress and run nude around the house. Should I be worried about that? And I've toyed with the idea of saying, well, yeah, that means they're going to be an exhibitionist. Well, it doesn't mean anything other than they like to take their clothes off and run around the house. So I caution and comfort and say, not a problem. Let them grow up. They'll be fine. They'll learn modesty in about 2 to 3 years, and all this will be removed. It is important, in my opinion, that we all should recognize that gender identity develops over time, like I've described, and in the middle there are questions and sometimes worries that exist, even though what is called diffusion, or the lack of certainty, is normal, and children should be allowed a certain amount of indefiniteness. My work as a family psychologist, I've spent time with individuals who have the following questions. Do people sometimes think they are gay, for example, or trans, and then turn out to be straight? Yes. What are believable signs of who I'm going to be? They want to know, am I going to be an adequate, successful male if I am like this or am I like that? And the answer is, well, you need to find out what that is, and then we'll talk more about it. Here's another question. How do I know what I am or what I'm going to be? Now, if my sense of identity does not meet the expectations of my parents or our culture, then how do I adjust to that? What do I do about that? Well, for one thing, the answer to that is talk with people a lot and find out more so that you don't make this terrible mistake. This is what I say to them. Do not resolve all these questions by yourself. Some kids feel so strange or weird, like they're not acceptable here or not acceptable there, without ever knowing that most kids go through a period of time where they're not acceptable around girls or don't feel acceptable around boys. So then they're thinking, because I'm not, that maybe their gender is at issue. Okay, here's another one. I am afraid that if I'm different, I will be rejected. Is that likely to happen? Yes, it is. We still do not have enough acceptance or warmth or consideration in our elementary schools. And we probably ought to do better at teaching, not only probably, I'm sure, we should do better at teaching our children to be considerate and understanding of people who are the same and who are different than us. Here's another question. This is one that comes later on. What will my life be as a gay person or as a transgender? Well, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to answer that very well because I had not seen at that time a lot of gay people. I have since that time, and I can answer that. I can say, here's some things that likely happen, and you probably need to run in this or you run into that, and so here's a good way to respond to that. Overall, the answer includes learning to be comfortable with themselves. Now, from having been asked these questions and the other experiences, I've had the privilege of knowing several sincere people faced with very complex situations who are honestly trying to find the best sense of themselves. And I therefore have acquired a great deal of respect and affection for these individuals. And I do not wish in any way to be disrespectful. I don't think we ought to humiliate or isolate any of these individuals. I wish instead to communicate the importance of being sensitive and to work toward two objectives. I want to help parents who wish to know how identities form and who want to help their children develop a gender identity where their gender behavior and sexual orientation matches their sex at birth. I want to repeat that. I want to be focused on helping parents who wish to know how identities form and who want to help their children develop a gender identity where the gender behavior of their children and sexual orientation matches their sex at birth. The other, I hope, is to help parents who have children where identity is not certain and encourage them in regard to patience and love for those children where there is not yet clear what their sexual orientation might be. Our history about sexual orientation is not real positive in many situations. I know, and I'm old enough to know that when somebody looks effeminate, for example, individuals start thinking negative things about him if he's a boy, and girls are tomboys, and that's always suspect, and so on. And I recall these parents coming to my office one day and they're upset and somewhat angry and they want to know what to do about their son who has just come out. And I said, what have you done so far? And they said, well, we don't know what to say or do. And I said, get on the phone with him right now and tell him that you love him and that no matter what happens, you're going to love him and still be his parents. Just because he has a trouble with his gender identity doesn't mean he's no longer your son. Now, many may think that any identity is healthy and successful, and many think that where acceptance and support for all individuals are concerned, there should be an important point for us or for anyone to consider. But, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, I decided that this lesson is for parents and about what you can do to promote a strong sense of identity in your children, where the gender identity matches your children's sex at birth. And in order to achieve that objective, I believe we should offer a clear definition of just one type of gender identity where sex at birth, gender behavior, and sexual orientation emerges as two options, male and female. With the foregoing in mind, then, I'm going to proceed to describe how identity develops and what you can do to promote it. And I'm going to focus on the development of one type of gender identity. That's the healthy kind, that is male and female, and that you might be able to see what you could do and not do as parents. And I hope you will review carefully what you can do to help your children form their own identity, where sex at birth is matched with gender-related behavior and the sexual orientation of these individuals toward members of the other opposite sex. And I'm going to offer a description provided by other people who are researchers and so on. So, for example, in their book, Identity Formation, Agency and Culture, James Coate and Charles Levine described conditions which lead to a healthy gender identity as I've defined it. And I've also seen I've seen their work in many families and so on. And here they are. First of all, consider that children identify something called self-knowledge. And this self-knowledge is about themselves, and it begins at birth. This knowledge, however, begins as beliefs or propositions that may or may not be true. And so children search for ways to define themselves. That is, they might hear from somebody, "You're ugly," when they're beautiful. And so they have to disconfirm some things that they might have learned. Now, the more accurate this self-knowledge is and a child has, the more likely he will make progress toward a healthy identity. I'm going to repeat that. The more accurate and the more information a child has about himself, then more likely he will be a healthy person. Now, children learn about their bodies, their minds, what they think or feel around people, what they believe to be right and wrong, and what emotions register in their minds. Children who, for one reason or another, that is illness, cognitive problems, and maybe those smothered by parents, have less self-knowledge are more likely to develop identity-related problems. Now, what can you do to promote children's self-knowledge? This is about themselves as boys and girls. Okay, here's one. Teach your children to think about their own feelings, to reflect on what motivates them, what their talents are, and how they express love, happiness, and gratitude. Ask how they think boys and girls are the same and different in their feelings. So emotional issues are big when it comes to gender identity. Also, ask your children to show how they acted when with others, what they felt during success and failure, what happiness means, and what love feels like. This knowledge is what a person thinks about himself in positive and definite ways. He knows the ideas are his own instead of repeating what others think, and he can self-reflect and understand what his experiences are like in different social situations. So then you're saying, when you are successful as a boy, what is that like? When you are successful as a girl, what is that like? And when you're not successful, what is that like? And tell me what it's like when you're not successful as a girl, so that you hear their own thoughts about it. Now, when your children have an experience of some kind, ask them to review what they learned and what they learned about themselves as a boy and a girl. You might think, well, I don't need to do that all the time, but I can tell you that growing up, gender is a core identity issue for all human beings. And so even if a boy is playing with other boys and he's not accepted, or he is accepted, or he can run faster than everybody else, whatever it is, you would say, I'd like to know what's that like for you as a boy, and the same for a girl. Now also, as a regular part of conversations with your children, ask them to identify things they think about and what they think other people think about as well, as a boy and as a girl. And so you're asking them to tell you what self-knowledge they're acquiring and why it is an important part of their life. Now, the second area you can get involved with in the development of children's self-knowledge is called a realistic self-awareness. Now, children vary in their abilities to be aware of themselves. Those who can introspect, reflect, and understand what conclusions they reach are most likely to progress toward a healthy identity. Now, think about that. Some children are more naturally reflective and some are not. Okay, and this doesn't have anything to do with gender to begin with, but it has to do with something called brain reactivity. Some children's brains are highly reactive and they're paying attention to all this stuff in the world around them, and other children's brains are more reflective or introspective. Generally speaking, it's not 100%, those who can introspect, reflect, and understand the conclusions they reach about themselves are most likely to progress toward a healthy identity. It's not a magic 100%. This means that those individuals see themselves as neither greater or less than other people. They also have a perspective of self-based or actual behavior or events. That is, they can look at themselves and say, well, this is what I actually did, or this is what I am like, not what they imagine. So as children grow older, you would say in a common experience, what were you like walking to school? And what were you like going to church? And what were you like sitting and doing your homework? And just ask them. Now notice how you have to be able to allow them to feel free to make choices and to say a variety of things, or like any intelligent child, they'll make adjustments because they are suspicious of why you're asking the question. So we want to have our children learn to not exaggerate ideas about themselves, which may be either positive or negative, than is actually true. I often tell even adults that the thing that is wrong with self-criticism primarily isn't just that it's negative, it's generally not true. The criticisms we come up with that feel, really intensely negative, we've made them up, and they're exaggerated. If we don't like something about ourselves, we may be upset or frustrated about it, but we know it's true and we can do something about it. Now, here's the point I want to make, and the point I want to use at the conclusion of this episode. Children who are less likely to achieve a healthy identity may have limited awareness of themselves because they are feeling strange or unusual in some situations. They may also feel so anxious that they focus on others instead of themselves. They are ego-centered enough that they do not reflect fully, but focus on one goal they wish to achieve. That is, as sociopathic individuals demand what they want when they want it, only to discover later that it is not what they wanted after all. And so that's because they don't understand themselves well enough to know what's true, what they really think or feel. Now let me briefly review. We want children in the stage of acquiring self-knowledge to be helped to understand their own thoughts and feelings. So what can you do as a parent? Well, you can begin early to ask your children to make decisions, to give them areas where they can decide for themselves and where they cannot. Many think that all children inherit the ability to act freely. They have free agency, that's true, but they don't know how to handle it usually. So instead, it will be necessary for them to learn how to exercise it. So let's suppose you say, I want to teach you how to make decisions, good decisions. Well, why? Because we want your children to make inner choices about outward situations. Another thing you can do is when examining what your children did around others, ask them to identify what it is they decided or chose to do and to explain why. Now, you can't do it, be an accuser. You have to be calm and say, I just like to see what you see. Another thing is to praise positive examples when children make good choices, of course. Regulate your anxiety so you don't over-control, nag, remind, demand, and in so doing, reduce your children's sense of agency. I would like to tell you, I won't take the time, but it's just so interesting when parents will call and say, I have a problem with this child. I'll have a chance to visit with the child. And then they'll come and say, what can we do? What can we do? And I said, it would be really a good thing if you just backed off. If you just gave your child a little more time and started to teach them to make more decisions. Because it turns out that a lot of loving parents are anxious about them and they cause problems for their kids. And then last, to demonstrate the process of using your freedom to make choices and explain there are some good and some bad choices, but one of the worst is to not decide at all. Now I'm going to conclude this episode at this point, and I want to remind you that I've mentioned two things. The development of self-knowledge, and I've given you some ideas about that, and the importance is to teach children to exercise free choice. Choice, as it turns out, is one of the most significant ingredients to a sense of healthy gender identity because it's the child's mind who chooses to say, I am this, or I am that. and so you want to teach them to be good choice makers about themselves.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the First Answers podcast, which is sponsored by FirstAnswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids, with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Find First Answers on Facebook, and remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the Podcasts app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about First Answers. Check out another podcast by Dr. Scoresby called The Christ Questions, which is centered on questions we ask about Jesus Christ and questions he asks us. Dr. Scoresby examines how Christians can build faith in Jesus Christ that lasts and discover the true blessings and rewards for believing.